The phone rang at 2 in the morning on March 10th, 1963, 3 days before Cassius Clay's Madison Square Garden debut against hometown hero Doug Jones. And when Clay picked up the receiver in his hotel room at the Americana, the voice on the other end spoke slowly enough that Clay understood this wasn't a question but a statement disguised as conversation. "You fighting in New York. Now, that means you've got expenses you probably haven't considered. Protection being one of them. Arrangements being another, and we're calling to make sure you understand how business works in this city before you step into that ring." Clay, 21 years old and undefeated through 17 professional fights, had won an Olympic gold medal 3 years earlier in Rome, and then barnstormed through the heavyweight division with a combination of speed, skill, and showmanship that made him the most talked-about fighter since Sugar Ray Robinson. But he'd never faced this particular challenge, the challenge of organized crime, trying to take piece of his purse before he'd even earned it, trying to extract payment for protection he hadn't requested and arrangements he didn't need, trying to establish dominance through midnight phone calls that suggested consequences for refusal without explicitly stating what those consequences might be. "Who is this?" Clay asked, his voice steady despite the hour and the implication. "Someone who's been watching you train, someone who knows you're good but might not be good enough. If things happen during the fight that shouldn't happen, someone who wants to make sure everything goes smooth for you. Wednesday night, because we'd hate to see a promising career get interrupted by unfortunate circumstances. Translation, pay us or we'll arrange for something bad to happen." Not necessarily in the ring. These people were too smart to fix fights that openly boot. Maybe in the locker room, maybe in the hotel, maybe in the street after the fight when security wasn't watching as closely and accidents could occur that wouldn't look like organized hits, but would send clear message that refusing mob offers carried serious risks. Clay had grown up in Louisville under Jim Crow, had experienced racism so pervasive that his mother once told him the story of being denied water at a department store because of her skin color. And he'd learned early that power came in many forms: legal power that wrote laws, economic power that controlled resources, and street power that operated outside both legal and economic systems through force and intimidation. The voice on the phone represented that third type of power, the kind that couldn't be challenged through courts or commerce, but only through direct confrontation or strategic capitulation. "How much protection costs?" Clay asked, not because he planned to pay, but because he needed to understand what he was refusing. $5,000 from your purse. That's reasonable, considering the gate they're expecting, considering what you're making, considering the alternative. $5,000. Clay's purse for the Doug Jones fight was $90,000, the biggest payday of his career to that point, but $5,000 represented more than money. It represented submission to system where fighters paid tribute to criminals just for privilege of earning living in their sport, where success brought not just fame and fortune, but also obligation to support parasitic infrastructure of people who contributed nothing but demanded everything, where refusing meant risking violence that police couldn't or wouldn't prevent because organized crime had connections throughout law enforcement that made investigation unlikely and prosecution nearly impossible. "I need to think about it," Clay said finally. "You got until Tuesday midnight. After that, the price goes up and the offer gets less friendly." The line went dead. Clay sat on the edge of his bed in darkness, holding the silent phone, understanding that he'd just been presented with choice that would define not just this fight, but potentially his entire career. Submit to extortion and establish precedent that he could be controlled, or refuse and accept whatever consequences followed. He called Malcolm X. Malcolm had been mentoring Clay for months, teaching him about Nation of Islam, about black self-determination, about the importance of controlling your own destiny rather than allowing white America or anyone else to dictate terms of your existence. And when Clay explained the late-night call and the demand for $5,000, Malcolm listened without interrupting until Clay finished. "You're facing the same thing every successful black man in America faces," Malcolm said quietly. "The moment you start making real money, everyone wants piece of it. Government wants taxes, promoters want their cut, and criminals want protection money. The question is whether you're going to be man who stands on principle or man who pays to avoid trouble. They threatened me. Of course they did. That's how extortion works. They make you afraid of what might happen if you refuse. afraid enough that paying seems like cheaper option than standing up for yourself. But here's what they don't tell you. Once you pay the first time, you pay forever. Once they know you can be intimidated, they'll keep coming back with new demands, eager prices, until you're working for them instead of working for yourself. Clay knew Malcolm was right, but knowing principle was correct didn't make adhering to it easier when adherence might result in violence. What should I do? You should do what every self-respecting black man should do when criminals try to take what he earned. Tell them to go to hell and mean it. But you should also be smart about how you refuse, because these aren't people who accept rejection without response. How do I be smart about refusing? You talk to Bumpy Johnson. The name meant nothing to Clay, who'd grown up in Kentucky and spent most of his professional life training in Miami under Angelo Dundee. But Malcolm explained that Bumpy was the most powerful figure in Harlem's underworld, the black man who'd made deal with Italian mafia decades earlier that allowed him to run his own operation independently as long as he paid tribute. The criminal who'd gone to Alcatraz in 1952 for heroin conviction and returned to Harlem in 1963, just months earlier, to find his neighborhood changed, but his reputation intact. The strategist who understood that real power came not from violence, but from respect earned through fairness, and force applied proportionally. Bumpy protects Harlem, Malcolm said, not in the sense that Italian mob talks about protection, which is really just in the sense that he keeps order, he enforces rules, and he doesn't let outsiders come into the community and take what belongs to people who live there. If Italian mob is trying to squeeze you, Bumpy might be interested in preventing that, because you're fighting Doug Jones, who's from Harlem, and that fight represents something bigger than two men in a ring. It represents whether Harlem gets respected or whether outsiders get to take whatever they want. Subscribe to see how one phone call changed the rules about who paid whom and why. Protection meant something completely different depending on who was providing it and what principles guided their decisions. The meeting happened the next afternoon at Small's Paradise on 7th Avenue, the nightclub that had been Harlem institution since Prohibition, where jazz musicians played until dawn, and where people of influence gathered to conduct business that couldn't be conducted in offices or courtrooms because it existed outside legal commerce in realm of understood agreements and unspoken arrangements. Clay arrived with Malcolm X, both men dressed in dark suits that made them look more like ministers than fighter and activists, and they were escorted to a back booth where Ellsworth Raymond Bumpy Johnson sat, reading a newspaper, drinking coffee, looking more like college professor than crime boss. No flashy jewelry, no expensive clothes, no bodyguards hovering obviously nearby, just a 57-year-old man with intelligent eyes and calm demeanor who projected authority through presence rather than display. Malcolm tells me you got a phone call, Bumpy said after introductions, folding his newspaper carefully and setting it aside as if this conversation deserved his complete attention, even though Clay was just another young fighter with a problem that probably seemed insignificant compared to running criminal empire. Clay explained the situation: the midnight call, the demand for $5,000, the veiled threats about unfortunate circumstances, and Bumpy listened the way judges listen to testimony, weighing every word for accuracy and implication, determining credibility through details that liars typically overlooked because they were too focused on maintaining their false narratives to remember that truth resided in specifics rather than generalities. "Vincent sent people to squeeze you," Bumpy said when Clay finished. "That's his style. Wait until fighters are committed to fights in New York, then demand payment for nothing except his blessing to compete without interference. It's not about money, really. It's about establishing that he controls the city, that nobody makes money here without his approval." Vincent was Vincent Chinjik, the Genovese crime family boss who'd been trying to consolidate control over all organized crime operations in New York for years, including Harlem, where Bumpy's presence complicated those efforts because Bumpy represented alternative power structure that operated by different rules and served different community. "Can you help me?" Clay asked directly, appreciating that Bumpy seemed to prefer straightforward conversation over diplomatic circumlocution. "Depends what you mean by help," Bumpy replied. "If you're asking whether I can call Vincent and tell him to back off, yes, I can do that. If you're asking whether I can guarantee your safety if you refuse to pay him, that's more complicated because guaranteeing safety requires commitment to use force if necessary, and force creates obligations that extend beyond single fight. What kind of obligations? The kind where, if I protect you, and Vincent tries something anyway, then I have to respond in ways that escalate situation beyond what you probably want to be involved in. You're a fighter, not a soldier. You don't want to be standing next to me when things get violent. And they will get violent if Vincent decides to test whether I'm serious about protecting you. This was the reality that most civilians never understood about organized crime. Protection wasn't passive service, but active commitment that required willingness to deploy violence as deterrent and punishment, that required relationships based on mutual understanding that certain actions would trigger certain responses, that required everyone involved to know that protection without enforcement was just empty promise that criminals would test until they determined it was meaningless. Have you ever had to decide whether accepting help meant accepting everything that came with it, whether protection offered by dangerous people was better or worse than facing danger alone, whether principles about self-determination applied even when determination meant potential harm? Comment below whether you'd have taken Bumpy's offer or faced the mob alone, whether protection with obligations is better than independence with risk, whether refusing to pay meant anything if you just accept it. Different power dynamic instead. What do you want in exchange for protecting me? Clay asked, because he understood that nobody offered help without expecting something in return, that favors created debts that eventually came due, that even if Bumpy's offer was genuinely intended to help rather than exploit, there would be implicit expectation of reciprocity when Bumpy needed something that Clay could provide. Bumpy smiled slightly, as if he appreciated that Clay understood this basic truth about human relationships, especially relationships that began with one person needing help and another person providing it. I don't want money, if that's what you're thinking. I don't operate like Vincent. I don't squeeze people who haven't done anything to me, and you haven't done anything except train hard and talk loud, which I actually respect, because talking loud is better than talking quiet when you got something worth saying. Then, what do you want? I want you to understand something about power in Harlem, Bumpy said, his voice dropping lower as if he was sharing secret that couldn't be spoken at normal volume even though they were alone in the back booth, where nobody could overhear them. When Vincent tries to squeeze you, he's not just trying to get $5,000. He's trying to establish that Italian mob controls everything and everyone, including black fighters who come to New York to make their names. He's trying to prove that even someone like you, Olympic gold medalist, undefeated, professional, friend of Malcolm X, has to bow down to him just like every other person who does business in this city. Clay nodded slowly, beginning to understand that this wasn't really about him specifically, but about broader struggle over who wielded power and how that power was exercised. If I protect you and you don't pay Vincent, Bumpy continued, that sends different message. It says black men in Harlem don't automatically submit to Italian mob just because Italian mob says submit. It says there's alternative power structure that operates by different rules, rules that don't include extorting fighters for money they haven't earned yet. It says that protection, real protection, not extortion disguised as protection, is something I provide to people in my community, because I believe in protecting the community, not because I want to exploit it. So you're protecting me to make a point? I'm protecting you because it's the right thing to do, and because Vincent needs to understand that his reach has limits, and because I don't believe black athletes should have to pay tribute to white criminals just for privilege of competing in sport, where they're already facing discrimination and disadvantages. But yes, I'm also making a point. The point is that power doesn't always mean taking from people. Sometimes power means protecting people from being taken from. Clay looked at Malcolm, who nodded slightly as if to say, "This is what I meant when I told you to talk to Bumpy. This is the difference between extortion and actual protection. This is what leadership looks like when it's motivated by principles rather than just profit." "What happens when Vincent finds out I'm not paying him?" Clay asked. "He'll probably send someone to talk to me," Bumpy said calmly, "and I'll explain that you're under my protection, which means anybody who touches you answers to me. And then we'll see whether Vincent wants to test that or whether he's smart enough to understand that this particular fight isn't worth the cost of finding out whether I'm bluffing. Are you bluffing? Bumpy's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes made Clay understand that this was not a man who bluffed about serious matters, that his reputation had been built on always delivering on promises, whether those promises were threats or offers of help, that asking whether he was bluffing was like asking whether the sun would rise tomorrow. Technically, the answer was yes, but the question itself revealed misunderstanding about the fundamental nature of what was being discussed. I never promise protection unless I'm prepared to provide it, Bumpy said quietly. That's what separates protection from extortion. Extortion is promising something you don't actually deliver and threatening harm you might not actually inflict. Protection is committing to defend people even when defense is dangerous or expensive, and backing that commitment with whatever force is necessary to make it real. Clay made his decision. Tuesday midnight came and went without Clay paying the $5,000, and on Wednesday morning, fight day, the same voice that had called him at the Americana called again, this time angry rather than threatening. You made a mistake, thinking you could ignore our offer. Now you're going to learn that mistakes in this city come with consequences. Clay handed the phone to Malcolm X, who'd been staying with him since Monday to help manage the situation. And Malcolm said 5 words that changed the entire dynamic. He's under Bumpy Johnson's protection. There was silence on the other end of the line for several seconds, the kind of silence that spoke volumes about what those 5 words meant to whoever had been calling, about the calculations being made regarding whether this was bluff or truth, about the risks of proceeding versus the embarrassment of backing down, about whether $5,000 was worth potential war with Bumpy Johnson over a fighter who hadn't even won the fight yet and might lose anyway. We'll see about that, the voice said finally, and hung up. At 6 that evening, 3 hours before the Doug Jones fight at Madison Square Garden, there was a knock on the door of Clay's hotel room. Malcolm answered it, and there stood 2 men who looked like they'd come directly from central casting for mob movie expensive suits, slicked back hair, expressions that suggested they'd seen and done things that normal people only read about in newspapers when boaties turned up in rivers or parked cars. "We need to talk to Clay," one of them said. "He's preparing for his fight," Malcolm replied evenly. "This will only take a minute." Malcolm didn't move from the doorway. "Unless you're here to wish him good luck, you can communicate through Bumpy Johnson, who's already made clear that Clay's under his protection and doesn't have business with anyone who hasn't cleared that business with Bumpy first." The 2 men looked at each other, and Clay, who was watching from the bedroom, saw something pass between them that he'd later describe as recognition of reality. The moment when people who'd been operating under one set of assumptions realized those assumptions no longer applied, and different rules now governed the situation they were facing. "Tell Clay he got lucky," the first man said finally. "Tell him Bumpy won't always be there to shield him, and when Bumpy's not around anymore, he'll have to pay what he owes." "Clay doesn't owe anything," Malcolm said firmly. "That's the entire point." The men left without further conversation, and Malcolm closed the door and turned to Clay with expression that combined relief and concern. "They backed down tonight, but this isn't over. Vincent will test Bumpy's commitment, and when he does, things could get violent. You need to understand that accepting Bumpy's protection means you're now part of power struggle that's bigger than boxing." Clay understood, but he also understood something else. That sometimes standing on principle required accepting risks that came with principle, that refusing to pay extortion meant accepting possibility of retaliation, that protecting your dignity and self-determination might cost more than $5,000 in the short term but was worth infinitely more in the long term because dignity and self-determination couldn't be purchased after you'd sold them for temporary safety. That night, at Madison Square Garden, Clay fought Doug Jones in front of a sold-out crowd of 18,732 fans who paid $304,000 in gate receipts to watch 2 men compete for supremacy in sport that was simultaneously athletic competition and metaphor for larger struggles about power, respect, and dignity. The fight was brutal. Jones landed hard shots that hurt Clay, made him work harder than he'd expected, forced him to prove his skill and toughness through 10 rounds that many observers scored for Jones, because the hometown fighter had given the brash young challenger more trouble than anyone anticipated. But Clay won the decision, narrow but unanimous from the judges, controversial but defensible based on his stronger finish in the final 3 rounds, where he'd raised his pace and outboxed Jones, convincingly enough to erase doubts about whether he deserved victory. And after the fight, when reporters asked about the boos from crowd that had wanted Jones to win, when they questioned whether Clay had really defeated the Harlem fighter convincingly enough to justify all his pre-fight boasting, Clay said something that most people didn't understand at the time, but that carried deeper meaning for those who knew about the conflict with Gigante's mob. "I don't just win fights in the ring. I win fights everywhere outside the ring, in the streets, in the power struggles that most people never see. And I win those fights by standing with people who believe in principles instead of profit, who protect instead of extort, who make Harlem safe for fighters like Doug Jones, instead of using fighters like me to prove that nobody's safe unless they pay tribute to criminals." Have you ever seen someone refuse to submit to power and then be protected by different power that operated by different rules? Someone who rejected extortion and found genuine protection from person who believed protecting community was more important than exploiting it. Leave a like if you understand that sometimes the biggest shock isn't violence, but restraint. Isn't what powerful people do, but what they refuse to do. Isn't taking but giving without expecting immediate return. The real shock came 3 days after the fight, when word spread through New York's organized crime networks that Bumpy Johnson had publicly told Vincent Gigante's representatives that any attempts to harm or intimidate Clay would be treated as attacks on Bumpy himself and would be met with force that would make the consequences clear to everyone watching. This was unprecedented, not because Bumpy had protected someone, which he did regularly for people in Harlem who were being exploited or threatened, but because he'd protected someone who wasn't from Harlem, someone who wasn't part of his organization, someone who represented nothing to him except principle that athletes shouldn't have to pay criminals for permission to compete in sport they'd trained their entire lives to master. Vincent could have responded with violence. He could have ordered hits on Clay, or Malcolm X, or Bumpy himself, could have triggered war that would have resulted in deaths and arrests and headlines that would have brought unwanted attention to everyone involved in organized crime. But he didn't, because Vincent was a pragmatist who understood that wars cost money and lives and reputation. And this particular war would have been about principle rather than profit, about ego rather than economics, about forcing Bumpy to back down rather than securing any material gain that justified the cost. So Vincent did what pragmatic criminals do when confronted with losing proposition. He accepted the loss, moved on to easier targets, and told his people that Clay wasn't worth the trouble because the amount of money involved was trivial compared to other operations they controlled, and because antagonizing Bumpy over a single fighter made no strategic sense when they had larger interests that required Bumpy's cooperation, or at least his non-interference. But within Harlem, the story became Legend, the version where Clay bravely refused to pay mob protection and stood alone against threats, but the version where Bumpy Johnson demonstrated that protection could mean something other than extortion, that power could be exercised in ways that served community rather than exploiting it, that refusing to take money from someone who hadn't harmed you and didn't owe you anything could shock people more profoundly than any violence possibly could. Because it violated fundamental assumptions about how criminals operated and what motivated their decisions. Years later, after Clay had changed his name to Muhammad Ali, after he'd won the heavyweight championship and converted to Nation of Islam publicly, after he'd refused military induction and been stripped of his title and been banned from boxing for 3 years during his prime, people would ask him about the most important lessons he'd learned during his rise to greatness, and Ali would tell them about the night before the Doug Jones fight, about the phone calls demanding protection money, about meeting Bumpy Johnson, about learning that real protection meant defending principles rather than collecting tributes, about discovering that some powerful people wielded their power to shield others instead of to dominate them. Bumpy taught me something I never forgot. Ali said in an interview decades later. He taught me that you don't measure a man's power by how much he can take from people, but by how much he's willing to give up to protect principles that matter more than profit. He could have charged me for his protection, could have asked for $5,000 or $10,000 or percentage of my future earnings, and probably would have paid, because paying him would have been different than paying mob that was trying to extort me. But he didn't ask for anything except that I understand what he was doing and why he was doing it. And that lesson was worth more than any amount of money, because it taught me that power without principle is just violence. But power with principle can change how everyone thinks about what's possible. The shock wasn't that Bumpy protected Ali. The shock wasn't even that Bumpy stood up to Gigante on behalf of someone who wasn't part of his organization. The real shock, the one that left the world stunned, because it violated everything people thought they understood about how organized crime operated, was that Bumpy Johnson, one of Harlem's most notorious criminals, demonstrated higher standard of ethics than supposedly legitimate business people who extracted fees and tributes and percentages from athletes they'd done nothing to train or promote or develop, who use legal contracts and negotiating leverage to take what criminals use threats to take, who operated in sunlight what the mob operated in shadows, but arrived at same destination through different paths. Subscribe for more stories about moments when criminals demonstrated principles that shocked law-abiding society, when protection meant something other than extortion, when refusing to take money from someone who needed help redefined what power meant and how it should be wielded, and when one decision not to charge for services created legacy that lasted longer than any fortune built on exploitation ever could. The Allianz fight grossed over $800,000, including closed-circuit television revenue, and Clay's $90,000 purse represented more money than he'd earned in his entire career to that point. He never paid protection to anyone, not to Gigante's mob, not to Bumpy Johnson, not to anyone who tried to extract tribute just for allowing him to compete in sport where his skill had already earned him every dollar he received. And Bumpy never asked for payment, never called in favor, never suggested that Clay owed him anything beyond the understanding they'd reached in the back booth at Small's Paradise about what protection meant and why it mattered that some people provided it without demanding compensation beyond satisfaction of knowing they'd done the right thing when easier path would have been to do nothing or to exploit situation for personal gain. That's what left the world in shock, not violence, not threats, not war between competing crime families over who controlled what territory. What shocked everyone was the discovery that principles could override profit, even in a world where profit was supposed to be only principle that mattered. That criminal with reputation for violence and ruthlessness could demonstrate restraint and generosity that supposedly respectable business people lacked. That refusing to take money from someone who needed help could matter more than any amount of money that could have been extracted through intimidation or obligation. Bumpy Johnson died 5 years later, in 1968, but the story of how he protected Muhammad Ali without charging protection money, how he demonstrated that principles mattered more than profit, how he shocked everyone by refusing to exploit opportunity that any other criminal would have monetized, became part of his legend, the legend that said power didn't have to mean taking from those who had less, that protection didn't have to mean extortion, that criminals could sometimes exhibit ethics that shamed those who claimed moral superiority just because they operated within boundaries of law, even as they violated spirit of fairness and justice that law was supposed to uphold. And Ali never forgot. When he spoke about mentors who'd shaped his understanding of power and principle, he mentioned his trainers and his managers and Malcolm X. But he also mentioned Bumpy Johnson, the man who'd taught him that refusing to pay mob protection meant nothing if you just accepted different kind of obligation in return. That real independence required finding people who helped without expecting payment. That protection offered without strings attached was rarest form of power because it required believing that strengthening others strengthened community rather than weakening your position within it. The belief that protecting others without demanding payment could matter more than any fortune built on exploitation is what left the world in shock when people finally understood what Bumpy had done and why he'd done it. Not because they'd never seen criminals refuse money before, but because they'd never seen criminal refuse money on grounds that taking it would violate principle more important than any profit. and that violation mattered even when nobody would have blamed him for taking what every other person in his position would have taken without hesitation or regret. That's the response that shocked the world. The response that didn't involve violence or threats or warfare, but instead involved restraint and generosity and commitment to ideal that power should protect rather than exploit, that strength should defend rather than dominate, that refusing payment could demonstrate more integrity than any amount of charity funded by profits, extracted from people too weak to resist. Muhammad Ali refused to pay the Harlem mob, and Bumpy Johnson's response wasn't to collect the money, instead it was to ensure nobody collected it, that the principle mattered more than the profit, that sometimes shocking the world means doing the right thing when everyone expects you to do the profitable thing, and discovering in that moment that power without principle is just violence, while power with principle can change how everyone thinks